You ever wake up and realize someone stole your property without even trying to hide it? The smell of fresh asphalt hit me before I even opened the door, thick and chemical, like something permanent had just been forced into place overnight, and when my boots hit the ground I heard it, that dull sticky crunch where loose gravel used to be, the sound of my private road no longer being mine, except it still was, and that's what made my stomach go cold, because stretching out in front of my house, smooth, black, and glistening under the early morning sun, was a perfectly paved strip of road with a brand new sign hammered into the dirt at the entrance that read Willow Creek Community Access, like it had always been there, like the last 15 years of ownership didn't exist, like the $80,000 I paid specifically to keep this land outside HOA control was just a suggestion someone decided to ignore, and I stood there breathing in that burnt tar smell, feeling it coat the back of my throat, watching as the first SUV rolled casually down what used to be my quiet stretch of gravel, tires humming where they used to crunch, and that's when I saw her, Victoria Hayes, stepping out of her white BMW at the far end of the road, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on like she was inspecting a project she owned, her heels clicking against my asphalt like she had every right to be there, and when she looked up and saw me standing there, she smiled, that slow, polished, practiced smile that said she had already decided how this was going to end, and for a second I didn't say anything, didn't move, just listened to the low hum of engines passing through my land like it was public infrastructure, and then she called out, voice sweet enough to sound like permission instead of theft, "We took care of that old road for you, it's part of the community now," and I remember the exact way the air felt in my chest when she said that, tight, controlled, not anger, not yet, just the quiet realization that this wasn't a mistake, this was a decision, planned, approved, executed while I slept, and the craziest part wasn't the audacity, it was the confidence, the absolute certainty that I wouldn't be able to do anything about it, that I'd complain, maybe call a lawyer, maybe file something that would drag on for months while they kept using it, that I'd eventually give up like everyone else who ever tried to push back against an HOA with connections, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew as they started treating my land like a public street, was that this road wasn't just private. It was the only legal access point their entire neighborhood depended on, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives by putting it in writing, in asphalt, in something I could prove, something I could control, and as another car rolled past me like I didn't exist, I felt something settle in, not anger, not frustration, just clarity, because they thought they upgraded my road for their benefit, but what they really did was give me the perfect setup, and I promise you this, by the time I was done, every single one of them was going to understand exactly who that road belonged to. I did not buy that land for convenience, I bought it for control, and every inch of that gravel road had a reason behind it that nobody in that neighborhood ever bothered to understand, because to them it just looked like a long dusty stretch leading to my house, but to me it was the one thing that kept their rules, their fees, and their constant interference exactly where I wanted it, off my property and out of my life. And I still remember the day I signed those papers like it happened yesterday, the smell of old wood in the title office, the weight of the documents in my hands, and the way the survey map spread across the table showed that thin strip of access cutting cleanly through the edge of their planned subdivision, marked clearly in bold lines as private, not shared, not negotiable, private, and the agent even looked at me twice when I told him I wanted that road included in the purchase. Like most buyers would have skipped it to save money, but I knew better because I had spent 15 years in commercial development watching exactly how homeowners associations operate, how they expand, how they push boundaries one small decision at a time until suddenly what was yours becomes theirs on paper and in practice, and I was not interested in being part of that slow bleed, so I paid the extra $80,000 without hesitation just to make sure that nobody could ever tell me what I could or could not do with the land I owned, and for years it worked exactly the way I intended. Quiet mornings with nothing but the sound of tires rolling over loose stone, evenings where the air stayed still and undisturbed, no traffic, no complaints, no letters taped to my door with passive-aggressive warnings about community standards, just space and control and the kind of silence you only notice once you have lived without it, until Victoria Hayes decided that silence did not fit her version of a perfect neighborhood, and from the moment she took over as president of that association, everything started to shift in small ways that most people would ignore, new signs going up, new rules getting circulated. Small changes that felt harmless until you looked at them together and realized they were all moving in one direction, expanding her reach, tightening her control, and I saw it coming long before anyone else did, the way she would drive past my road slower than necessary, the way her eyes lingered on that gravel like it offended her personally, like it did not belong in her carefully managed vision of uniform sidewalks and identical driveways, and I knew right then that it was only a matter of time before she tried something. I just did not expect her to move this fast or this boldly, to skip the usual letters and warnings and go straight to action while I slept, because people like Victoria do not ask for permission when they believe they already have authority, and standing there that morning watching strangers treat my property like a public street, I realized this was not just about a road anymore, this was about control, and she had just made her move first. Victoria Hayes was not the kind of person who made mistakes, she was the kind who made decisions and then built reality around them until everyone else accepted it as normal, and the more I watched her that morning, the clearer it became that this had been planned long before a single truck showed up with asphalt, because nothing about what I was seeing was rushed or improvised. The edges were clean, the grading was precise, the signage was already printed and mounted like it had been waiting in storage, and that told me everything I needed to know about how she operated. She did not react, she executed, and she expected everyone else to fall in line after the fact, and as she walked toward me with that same polished smile, heels clicking against the surface she had no legal right to stand on, I could already hear the tone in her voice before she even spoke, that calm, controlled cadence people use when they believe they are explaining something obvious to someone who just has not caught up yet, and she stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to catch the faint scent of expensive perfume mixed with the lingering tar in the air, and she gestured lightly down the road like she was unveiling a gift, explaining how the community needed better access, how the gravel had been an eyesore, how this improvement would increase property values for everyone, and the way she said everyone carried that quiet assumption that I was included in a decision I had never agreed to, and I let her talk, not interrupting, not reacting, just watching the small details most people miss, the way her fingers tightened slightly on the clipboard when I did not respond, the quick glance she made toward the cars already using the road like she needed to confirm the narrative was holding. And that was when I realized something even more important than the road itself. She was not expecting resistance, she was expecting compliance, because in her world, the pattern had always been the same: send a letter, apply pressure, escalate just enough to make it inconvenient for anyone to push back, and eventually people give in, not because they agree, but because fighting costs more time and energy than surrendering, and she had mistaken me for one of those people, which was almost impressive considering how obvious it should have been that I was not. But that is the thing about control: once someone has it long enough, they stop questioning whether it applies everywhere, and they start assuming it does. And as another car rolled past us, slowing slightly as the driver glanced between us like they were watching something they did not fully understand yet, Victoria shifted her weight and gave me that final line, the one meant to close the conversation before it even started, saying that everything had been handled through proper channels, that documentation would be sent, that there was no need to make this complicated, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because she was right about one thing: this was not going to be complicated. Not for me, because while she was busy expanding her control, she never stopped to consider the one variable she could not manage, the fact that every single move she made depended on access she did not own, and standing there in the quiet hum of traffic that did not belong, I could already see exactly how this was going to unfold, not today, not in a confrontation she could prepare for, but soon, in a way she would never see coming until it was already too late. The first day, it was just a few cars, slow and cautious like people testing something new, tires gliding over that fresh black surface while drivers glanced around as if expecting someone to stop them, but nobody did, and that silence became permission faster than I expected, because by the second day the traffic doubled, and by the third, it was constant. A steady stream of SUVs and pickup trucks cutting through what used to be my quiet stretch of land like it had always belonged to them. The sound alone was enough to change everything: no more crunch of gravel under tires, no more still mornings, just that low rolling hum that never quite faded, like background noise you cannot turn off once it starts, and I stood at the edge of the road more than once watching it happen, hands in my pockets, saying nothing, because reacting too early would have been exactly what Victoria expected: a complaint, an argument, something she could deflect with paperwork and policy, and instead I let it build, let the pattern establish itself so completely that nobody questioned it anymore, and that was when the details started piling up in ways she probably never even noticed: kids riding bikes straight down the center line like it was a neighborhood street, delivery trucks using it as a shortcut, tire marks cutting into the edges where my property line still technically existed even if nobody could see it anymore, and then came the letter, folded clean and deliberate, placed right at my front door like a final stamp of authority, the paper thick, official, the kind that smells faintly of printer ink and confidence, outlining maintenance fees, shared access language, and a list of community expectations that had somehow been extended to include land that was never part of their association, and I read every line slowly, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go on something they did not actually control, and what stood out was not what they wrote, it was what they assumed, that I would accept it, that I would either argue within their system or comply under pressure, that I would step into a framework they had already defined, and as I folded that letter back along its crease, I could hear another car pass behind me without slowing, another set of tires reinforcing the illusion that this was now theirs. And that was the moment it stopped being about reacting and became about timing, because everything they were doing was building dependency without realizing it, every car that used that road, every delivery that relied on it, every routine that formed around it was another layer they would not be able to walk away from easily, and Victoria, for all her planning, had overlooked the simplest rule of control: if you build something on ground you do not own, you are not creating power, you are borrowing it, and sooner or later, the person who actually owns that ground decides what happens next. And as the sun dipped lower that evening and the traffic kept moving like it belonged there, I made the decision to let it continue just a little longer, because the more normal it felt to them, the harder it was going to hit when that normal disappeared all at once. I did exactly what most people would do first. I tried to handle it the normal way, because even when you know something is wrong, there is still that part of you that expects systems to work the way they are supposed to, so I made the calls, sent the emails, and gave them every opportunity to correct what they had done without forcing it into something bigger, and the response came back exactly the way I should have expected: slow, polished, and completely dismissive, starting with the HOA office telling me everything had been reviewed and approved, that the road improvements were considered a benefit to the community, that any concerns I had could be addressed through their internal dispute process, which sounded reasonable until you realized their process only worked if you accepted their authority in the first place, and when I pushed further, when I made it clear that the land was not part of their jurisdiction, that the road had never been included in their governing documents, the tone shifted just enough to show what was underneath all that professionalism: subtle pressure wrapped in polite language, references to compliance, mentions of potential liens, reminders that legal action could become costly and time-consuming, all delivered like they were doing me a favor by warning me ahead of time, and I let them talk, just like I had with Victoria, because the more they explained, the more they revealed exactly how they planned to control the situation, not through facts, but through exhaustion, assuming that I would eventually decide it was easier to let them have it than to fight through layers of paperwork and legal noise. And for a moment, just a brief one, I considered it, not because they were right, but because I had seen this strategy work before on people who had less time, less knowledge, or less patience, and then I made one more call, not to them, but to the local non-emergency line, just to confirm what I already suspected, and the officer who returned my call was professional, neutral, explaining that property disputes like this fell under civil jurisdiction, that without immediate safety concerns there was nothing they could enforce on site, which meant exactly what it sounded like: no one was going to step in and stop the cars from using that road, no one was going to put up barriers or reverse what had been done overnight. And when I hung up, standing there with that quiet hum of traffic continuing behind me like it had every right to exist, I realized something important: the normal path was not going to fix this, not quickly, not cleanly, and definitely not in a way that would make them feel the weight of what they had done, because the system they were relying on was built to slow things down, to turn clear ownership into prolonged debate, and that was exactly where they had the advantage. But what they failed to understand was that I was not trying to win inside their system, I was letting them settle into a situation they believed they controlled, because once they did, once that road became essential to their daily routine, once they stopped seeing it as borrowed space and started treating it like guaranteed access, that was when the balance would shift, and I would not need their approval, their process, or their timeline to take it back. By the end of the first week, it was no longer a shortcut, it was their routine. And routines are dangerous when they are built on something that does not belong to you, because people stop thinking about how it works and start assuming it always will, and I could see that shift happening in real time every morning, the same vehicles at the same hours, tires rolling smoothly over that asphalt like it had always been there, Like the memory of gravel had already faded, and I started paying attention to the details that mattered, not the noise, not the complaints, but the patterns, who used it, when they used it, how often they relied on it without even realizing it, delivery trucks cutting their routes shorter, landscaping crews lining up along the edge, parents dropping off kids and saving a few extra minutes on their drive, all of it stacking up into something Victoria never accounted for, dependency, and the more I watched, the clearer it became that she had not just taken a road, she had redirected an entire flow of movement through land she did not control, and once something like that locks in, it is not easy to undo, not without disruption, not without consequences, and that was exactly what I needed, because every day they used that road, they were making my position stronger without knowing it, reinforcing the fact that access was no longer optional for them, it was essential, and I could feel that balance shifting slowly, quietly, in my favor, even as everything on the surface looked like I had already lost, and Victoria, confident as ever, leaned into it even further, expanding the idea, having additional signs placed at the entrance, subtle changes that made it feel more official, more permanent, like she was solidifying her version of reality one detail at a time, and I did not stop her, I did not argue, I did not escalate, because stopping her too early would have limited the impact, and I was not interested in limiting anything. I wanted it to reach the point where reversing it would not just be inconvenient, it would be impossible to ignore, and that required patience, something she clearly did not expect from me, because in her experience, people pushed back quickly or not at all, they reacted emotionally or they gave in, but they did not wait, they did not observe, and they definitely did not let things grow beyond her control on purpose, and that was the difference between what she thought was happening and what was actually unfolding, because while she believed she was expanding her authority, I was measuring exactly how far that authority depended on something she never owned in the first place. And as the days passed and the traffic became constant, predictable, necessary, I knew we were getting close, not to a confrontation, but to a moment where one decision would shift everything at once, and when that moment came, there would be no confusion, no debate, just a very clear reminder that control does not come from who uses something the most, it comes from who actually owns it. It was not a loud discovery, not some dramatic moment where everything suddenly made sense, it was quieter than that, the kind of realization that slips in when you stop reacting and start looking closely at what everyone else is ignoring. And for me it came from something as small as a metal survey marker half buried near the edge of the asphalt, one of the few pieces they had not completely erased when they paved over the road, and I noticed it late one afternoon when the light hit it just right, that faint glint cutting through the dark surface like a reminder that something still existed underneath what they had built, and I crouched down, brushed away the thin layer of dust and debris, and there it was, the original boundary point, untouched, unmoved, exactly where it had been documented years ago. And that was when everything shifted from assumption to confirmation, because markers like that do not lie, they do not change based on opinion or paperwork someone drafts after the fact, they are tied to records, to surveys, to legal definitions that exist whether people acknowledge them or not, and I stood up slowly, looking down the length of the road again, not as something that had been taken from me, but as something that had been built on top of proof they could not erase, and that sent me straight back inside, pulling out the original documents I had not needed in years, the thick folder that still carried the faint smell of paper and ink from the day I first signed it, and I spread everything out across the table, tracing lines, cross-referencing measurements, matching coordinates with what I had just seen outside, and piece by piece, it all lined up exactly the way I remembered, the road, the boundaries, the access points, every inch of it clearly defined as private property with no shared access, no easement, no clause that gave anyone else the right to use it without permission, and that was the crack in their entire system. The one detail Victoria either overlooked or assumed she could bypass, because everything she built depended on the idea that control could be created through use, through repetition, through confidence, but none of that changes ownership, and ownership was still exactly where it had always been, with me, and the more I reviewed those documents, the more I understood the position I was actually in, not defensive, not reactive, but holding something far more powerful than anything she had tried to establish, because while she had been focused on expanding outward, I still controlled the foundation everything she built was sitting on, and that realization did not come with urgency, it came with precision, because now it was not about whether I could take that road back, it was about when, and more importantly, how to do it in a way that made the lesson impossible to ignore. And as I closed that folder and looked back out at the steady flow of cars moving like nothing had changed, I knew the moment was getting closer, not because they were slowing down, but because they were getting more comfortable, and comfort is exactly what makes people forget to look for the ground beneath them until it is already gone. Once I had the documents laid out in front of me, it stopped being a question of belief and became a matter of proof, and proof has a very different weight when you know exactly how to use it, so I did not just rely on what I already had, I went deeper, pulling county records, cross-checking filings, reviewing every line that had ever been attached to that parcel of land, because if there was even a single clause they could point to, anything that suggested shared use or implied access, I needed to find it before they did, and the process was not fast, it was hours of quiet focus, the soft hum of my laptop, the occasional shuffle of paper as I moved between physical records and digital files, but piece by piece the picture became clearer, not weaker, stronger, because everything kept pointing to the same conclusion: the road was mine, fully, legally, without exception, and more importantly, there had never been any modification, no amendment, no recorded agreement that gave the homeowners association even partial rights to use it, which meant everything they were doing rested entirely on assumption and repetition, not law. And that is where things started to shift in my mind from defense to opportunity, because most people think of ownership as something you protect, something you defend when challenged, but what they had created out there on that road was something else entirely, a situation where other people were actively depending on property they did not have the right to use. And dependency changes the equation, it turns a static asset into leverage, and I confirmed that leverage the only way that matters, by verifying enforcement, not just theory. I made a call to a local towing company I had worked with years ago, kept the conversation simple, hypothetical on the surface but specific enough to get a real answer, asking what happens when vehicles are parked or left on private property without permission, and the response came back without hesitation: if the property is clearly marked and ownership is documented, removal is legal, no exceptions, no delays, and that answer did not come with drama, it came with certainty, the kind that only exists when something has been tested enough times to become routine, and I sat there for a moment after that call ended, listening to the distant sound of cars still moving over that asphalt outside, and for the first time since all of this started, I could see the entire structure of what they had built, not as something solid, but as something exposed, because every single vehicle using that road was now part of a system that depended entirely on my permission, whether they realized it or not, and that is when the final piece clicked into place, not as a reaction, not as anger, but as a plan forming with a level of clarity that only comes when every variable lines up, because they had already done the hardest part. For me, they had normalized the behavior, they had made it consistent, predictable, and most importantly, necessary, and all I had to do now was decide the exact moment to remind them that none of it actually belonged to them. By that point, I knew exactly what I had, but knowing something and using it are two very different things, and this was not the kind of situation where you rush in just because you can. This required timing, coordination, and the right people who understood how to execute without hesitation, so I reached out to someone I trusted, a guy named Daniel Mercer, someone I had worked with years back when I was still deep in development projects, the kind of person who knew how to move equipment, handle logistics, and more importantly, operate within the law without cutting corners. And when he answered the phone, I kept it simple at first, just catching up, letting the conversation settle into something normal before shifting into what I actually needed, explaining the situation piece by piece, not emotionally, just facts, ownership, usage, documentation. And when I mentioned the volume of traffic and the dependency that had built up, there was a pause on the other end, not hesitation. Recognition, because people who understand systems can see leverage when it is right in front of them, and his response came back calm, almost matter of fact, saying that if everything I was telling him checked out, then this was not complicated at all, it was just a matter of execution, and that word mattered, execution, not reaction, not retaliation, just a clean, controlled process carried out at the right moment. And we went through the details carefully, verifying what needed to be in place, signage, documentation on hand, clear boundaries established so there would be no confusion when it happened. Because the last thing I wanted was chaos. This was not about creating a scene, it was about making a point so clear that nobody could argue with it after the fact, and as we talked, I could hear trucks in the background on his end, engines idling, the kind of low mechanical hum that tells you things are always moving, always ready, and that sound blended with the memory of the constant traffic outside my house, two different systems. One built on assumption, the other built on structure, and I knew which one would hold when they finally collided, and before we ended the call, he said something that stuck with me, something simple but precise. He said once people rely on something long enough, they forget to ask who owns it, and when you remind them, you do not need to raise your voice, you just need to act, and that was exactly the approach I wanted. No warnings, no drawn-out arguments, just one clear moment where everything shifted at once. And after I hung up, I stepped outside. Again, watching the same steady flow of cars moving like nothing had changed, like nothing ever would, and for the first time since this started, I could see the full picture, not just what they had done, but how it was all going to end, because now it was no longer about whether I could take control back, it was about choosing the exact moment when it would matter the most, when the impact would be undeniable. And as another line of headlights rolled past me into the evening, I knew that moment was getting closer with every single car that chose to use a road they never had the right to touch. The plan did not start with action, it started with stillness, with watching the same pattern repeat long enough that it became invisible to everyone except me, because that is when people stop questioning what they're doing, and I needed that. I needed the road to feel permanent to them, so permanent that the idea of losing access would not even cross their minds, and over the next few days I made small adjustments that most people would never notice. Placing clear but unobtrusive signage at both ends of the road marking it as private property, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to establish visibility, enough that no one could claim they had no idea later, and I kept copies of every document ready, organized, accessible, not because I expected to use them in a conversation, but because I understood that when the moment came, clarity would matter more than explanation, and at the same time, I coordinated with Daniel, aligning timing, confirming availability, making sure everything could move quickly and cleanly when it needed to, because this was not something you drag out, this was something you execute in a single decisive window, and we chose that window carefully, not during the day when everything was scattered, not early evening when people were still coming and going, but late, when the road was full, when vehicles were settled, when routine had reached its peak and everything felt predictable, and as that night approached, I could feel the contrast building, the quiet outside my house different than it used to be, no longer empty, but filled with something temporary pretending to be permanent, and I stepped out one last time before it all shifted, looking down that stretch of asphalt that had replaced the gravel I chose years ago, hearing the faint ticking of engines cooling, the occasional distant door closing somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, and for a moment, everything was calm, almost peaceful, the kind of calm that only exists right before something changes, and I stood there without urgency, without hesitation, because by then there was nothing left to decide, every variable had been checked, every detail accounted for, and all that remained was timing, and timing, when you control the foundation, is not something you guess, it is something you choose, and as I turned back toward the house, the distant hum of a diesel engine began to rise from down the road, low at first, then steady, then unmistakable, and I knew exactly what that sound meant, not chaos, not conflict, just the beginning of a correction that had been set in motion long before anyone else realized it was coming. The first tow truck rolled in slow, headlights cutting through the dark like they had done this 1,000 times before, no rush, no hesitation, just quiet precision, and I stood off to the side as the low rumble of diesel engines filled the air, one after another lining up along the edge of the road that had been so confidently claimed just days earlier, and what struck me most in that moment was how normal it all felt, no shouting, no chaos, just a process unfolding exactly the way it was designed to, and as the first vehicle was lifted, smooth and controlled, the faint creak of metal and the soft shift of weight breaking the silence, a porch light flicked on down the street, then another, and within seconds the stillness of the neighborhood began to crack. Doors opening, voices rising in confusion, people stepping outside trying to understand what they were seeing, and I could hear it in their tone, not anger yet, just disbelief, because this did not match the reality they had accepted, the one where that road belonged to them. And then Victoria appeared, faster than I expected, walking toward the scene with that same authority she carried before, but this time there was something different in her pace, something sharper, more urgent. And when she reached the edge of the road, her voice cut through the noise, demanding explanations, insisting this could not happen, that this was community property, that there had to be some kind of mistake, and for the first time since this started, I stepped forward, not to argue, not to escalate, just to be present, holding the same folder I had reviewed days earlier, and when she turned toward me, there was a moment, brief but clear, where the confidence shifted, where certainty met something it could not override, and I handed her the document without a word, letting the printed lines speak for themselves, the boundaries, the ownership, the lack of any access rights, all of it laid out in a way that did not require interpretation, and around us the process continued, methodical, vehicle after vehicle being removed with the same steady rhythm, no urgency, no confusion, just execution, and the more it unfolded, the more the reality settled in. Not just for her, but for everyone watching, because this was not something that could be argued away in the moment. This was not a letter, not a warning, not a discussion. It was a direct result of something they had built without permission, and as the line of cars slowly disappeared and the road began to clear, the sound changed again, the constant hum fading back into something quieter, something closer to what it had been before, and I could see it in their faces, that shift from assumption to understanding, the realization that what they thought was permanent had always been temporary, and as the last truck pulled away, leaving the asphalt empty for the first time since it had been laid down, I looked down that stretch of road and felt that same stillness return, not as something taken back in anger, but as something restored with precision, exactly the way it should have been all along. The silence after the last tow truck left was heavier than any noise that came before it, the kind of silence that forces people to finally notice what has changed, and I stood there watching it settle across the road, no headlights cutting through, no engines humming, just the faint echo of what used to be routine now completely gone, and for a few seconds nobody said anything, not Victoria, not the neighbors gathered at the edge of the asphalt, because there was nothing left to argue, no assumption left to stand on, just the reality in front of them, and that is when the question started, not loud, not aggressive, but confused, directed more at her than at me, asking how this could happen, why no one had checked, why something this big had been treated like it already belonged to them, and I watched as the answers she had before no longer held the same weight, the confidence in her voice replaced with something tighter, more careful, because explanations only work when they match reality, and this did not, and as she tried to regain control of the situation, shifting the focus to legal follow-ups, to reviewing documents, to possible next steps, I could see it clearly, she was already moving into damage control, trying to reframe what had just happened into something temporary, something fixable, but the truth was much simpler than that. Nothing had been taken from them, nothing had been done unfairly, everything had just been corrected, and that difference matters. Because correction does not invite negotiation, it establishes a boundary, and boundaries, once enforced, are hard to ignore, and over the next few days, that boundary became very clear, the road stayed empty, no more casual traffic, no more deliveries cutting through, no more shortcuts turning into habits, just a clean stretch of asphalt that finally matched the ownership it had always belonged to, and I made one final adjustment, replacing the temporary signage with something permanent, clear lettering, visible from both ends, stating exactly what should have been obvious from the start, private road, no unauthorized access, simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand, and the effect was immediate, not just in behavior, but in tone, the way people moved around it now, slower, more aware, like they finally understood that what looked accessible was not the same as what was allowed, and as for Victoria, her presence changed too, less visible, less certain, no longer walking that road like it was an extension of her authority, because authority built on assumption does not survive contact with proof, and I did not need to follow up, did not need to push further, because the outcome had already done the work for me. The system she tried to impose had collapsed under its own weight the moment it met something real, something documented, something she could not redefine, and as I stood there one morning, listening again to the quiet that had been missing since all of this started, I realized that nothing about this had been about revenge, not really, it had always been about clarity, about making something undeniable in a way that words never could, and sometimes the most effective way to do that is not by arguing, not by escalating, but by letting people build their own assumptions until they are strong enough to break under the truth. The gravel never came back, and that was the one thing most people did not expect, because to them this had always been about appearance, about what looked right, what fit their version of order, but for me it was never about restoring the past, it was about reinforcing the truth, and the truth was simple, that road was mine, whether it was gravel or asphalt did not change that, what mattered was who controlled it, and in the weeks that followed, that control became something you could feel. Without anyone having to say it out loud, the traffic stayed gone, not because people suddenly forgot it was there, but because they understood the boundary now, understood that access was not something you take just because it is convenient, and every once in a while, someone new to the neighborhood would slow down at the entrance, reading the sign, looking down the road like they were considering it, and then choosing to turn away. And that quiet decision, repeated over and over, did more than any argument ever could. It reset the expectation. And as for Victoria, she never tried to push it again, not directly, because once something has been made that clear, once the line has been drawn and enforced without hesitation, even people like her understand when there is nothing left to challenge, and I would still see her from time to time, driving past the entrance, her pace slower now, her attention different, not ownership, not inspection, just awareness, and that was enough, because this was never about humiliating anyone or escalating into something bigger. It was about correcting something that should have never happened in the first place, and doing it in a way that made it stick, and every now and then, usually early in the morning when the air is still and the light hits the road just right, I will stand there for a minute and listen, not to engines or voices, but to the absence of them, that quiet that had been missing for a while, and it always reminds me of how easily people confuse access with ownership, how quickly they build routines on things they never had the right to use, and how fast that illusion falls apart when it meets something real, something documented, something enforced without hesitation, because in the end, it was never about the road itself. It was about the principle behind it, and that principle does not need to be loud to be effective, it just needs to be clear, because once people understand exactly where the boundary is, they stop testing it, and that is when control becomes permanent, not because you fight for it every day, but because you only had to prove it once.